I'd always been mocked and belittled, but I cleared my name with proof. It wasn't that I couldn't fight back. I was just laser-focused on the SATs. Hannah's confession hid the truth about the car accident, a play for sympathy, but a single word of understanding from Ava at her hospital bed meant more than any of Hannah's excuses. Right before the SATs, the school's queen bee, Hannah, assumed I had a crush on her. She tore up my test paper in front of everyone and laid on the insults. When it comes to dating, she'd said, you can't just focus on how great the other person is. You have to take a hard look at what you bring to the table. I didn't say a word. To them, I was just a loser who couldn't even break 200 across all 6 subjects. But they had no idea that I was bound to a system that let me trade my test scores for life. My only goal was to save my first love, Ava, whose life was hanging by a thread. The day of the SATs, her condition finally stabilized, and the system's connection to me was severed on the spot. Later, as the state's top scorer, I got into Harvard. And that's when the queen bee, who'd tormented me, finally started to panic. The moment the scores were posted, my classmates swarmed into the hallway to check the rankings. I stayed put, not moving an inch. The classroom erupted in noise, but I just lowered my head, pulled out a sheet of scratch paper, and kept working on the advanced problems from last night's homework. A few minutes later, students started trickling back from the hallway, their faces plastered with open mockery as they looked at me. I could faintly hear them talking. James Miller is dead last again. His total for all 6 subjects is barely over 150 this time. Pathetic. I bet I could just stomp on the answer sheet and score higher than him. Whatever. Seeing him so calm actually makes me feel better about my own chances. I tuned them out completely, my head down, focusing only on the scratch paper as I worked through the solution for the next major chemistry problem. When they saw I wasn't giving them a reaction, they must have gotten bored because after a few snickers, they went back to their seats. I was deep in concentration, working through a problem, when my desk mate Mike shot up from his seat. He pointed at my desk drawer and yelled, "Hey, what's this?" Before I could even get a good look, he pulled out a light blue hair clip. I froze for a second, then lunged for it, a rare panic in my voice. "Give it back. That's mine." But Mike had no intention of returning it. He just grinned and tossed the clip to the guy next to him. The small, light blue clip was passed from hand to hand. A knot of panic tightened in my stomach, and I had to fight the urge to lunge and grab it back. My obvious distress only seemed to fuel their amusement. They were always using my terrible grades as an excuse to make me the butt of their jokes, and I'd always just ignored them. But now that I was finally showing a reaction, their faces lit up with excitement. Then Mike scratched his head, putting on a show of sudden realization. "Hey, didn't Hannah Thompson lose a hair clip a while back? I think it was light blue, just like this one. She even put up flyers for it on the school bulletin board." He paused, then his tone shifted. "You don't have a crush on her, do you? Did you actually steal her hair clip?" The classroom went dead silent for a beat, then exploded with whispers that rippled through the rows of desks. Hannah Thompson was our school's undisputed queen bee, the center of all gossip. Right before the bell rang, I finally managed to get the clip back. I didn't bother explaining that it wasn't hers. I just carefully wiped it off and tucked it safely into an inner compartment of my backpack. I never expected that before first period that afternoon, Hannah herself would show up at our classroom door. I figured she was there to see our homeroom teacher, Ms. Davis, so I didn't pay much attention. But then, she started walking straight toward my desk. She stopped beside my desk, looked down at me, and said coolly, "So, I hear you have a crush on me?" The second Hannah Thompson walked into our classroom, every eye was on us. It made sense. She wasn't just gorgeous, she came from a wealthy family and was consistently ranked number 1 in our grade. I, on the other hand, was known for being at the bottom, barely able to scrape together 200 points on a good day. Someone like her and a nobody like me should have never crossed paths. Yet here she was, standing right next to my desk, and I could see the smug, gloating looks on my classmates' faces. I kept my mouth shut. There was no point in explaining. The more I'd say, the guiltier I'd look. It was better to just stay silent. The smirk on Hannah's lips slowly faded as she casually brushed her hair back, her eyes drifting over me with disinterest. "James, has anyone ever told you that when it comes to relationships, You shouldn't just focus on what the other person has. Her voice was deceptively sweet, but the mockery underneath was sharp and clear. Her eyes then shifted to the test on my desk. It was a math test with a glaring, bright red 17% scrawled across the top. Hannah let out a cold laugh, snatched the paper from my desk, and ripped it to shreds in front of the entire class. With a lingering smirk, she tossed the pieces aside and finished her thought. You also have to consider your own worth, James. This is the last time I'm going to tell you. If you really do have a crush on me, you'd better get rid of any ideas you have about it. A moment of silence hung in the air. Then the classroom erupted with laughter. Despite her public humiliation, my expression remained unchanged. I looked up at her and said, slowly and clearly, I don't have a crush on you. And I didn't take your hair clip. It was obvious no one believed me, least of all Hannah. She shot me a scornful look, as if I were a complete joke, and walked out of the room just seconds before Ms. Davis walked in. I bent down and gathered the shredded pieces of my test, carefully smoothing them out before folding them and placing them in my binder. I didn't respond to Hannah's provocation. The SATs were right around the corner, and I wasn't going to waste a single minute on pointless drama. After evening study hall, I stayed behind to keep working on practice problems, just like I always did. No one could understand why a guy who could barely break 200 was trying so hard. I didn't pack up my books until the clock struck 11. I didn't go home. Instead, I headed straight for downtown General Hospital. Standing at the entrance, I took a deep breath and mentally called out to the system. A moment later, the familiar, robotic voice echoed in my mind. Host, what can I do for you? I rubbed my temples and got straight to the point. How many more points do I need to completely heal Ava? The system seemed to run a complex calculation, falling silent for a long moment before it answered. Target value is approaching. Continue to maintain low scores. There is a high probability that Ava will make a full recovery before the SATs. It even added a few token words of encouragement. The tension I'd been carrying all day finally began to ease. As long as Ava could be saved, none of the rest mattered. Ava and I grew up together. She was my first love. She was always a brilliant student, consistently at the top of her class. But after an accident, she fell into a vegetative state. Her parents consulted with every specialist and hospital they could find, but the answer was always the same. There was nothing to be done. I never had many friends growing up. To everyone else, I was just the weird kid, the failure. Ava was the only one who ever stood up for me when everyone else wrote me off. To me, she was different from anyone else in the world. Then, on my birthday that year, something calling itself the Points for Life system appeared in my mind. It told me that if I intentionally bombed my tests, the points I should have earned would be converted into life force for her, helping her to slowly recover. I didn't believe it at first, but after tanking my scores a few times, I saw that Ava's vitals actually started to improve. From that day on, I made sure my scores never went above 200. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, but it was my reality. I clutched the hair clip in my hand and pushed open the door to Ava's room. She was lying peacefully in the hospital bed, her eyes closed. I gently placed the light blue hair clip on the nightstand beside her. It was her birthday gift, which I'd gotten for her early. I sat by her bed, watching her for a long time, until the system's voice echoed in my head again. The host must press on. It is imperative that Ava is fully healed before the SATs. I knew what it was telling me. We had an agreement. No matter whether Ava woke up or not, the system would detach itself on the day of the SATs. That was our deadline. I looked down, gently brushed a strand of hair from Ava's forehead, and whispered, I will. The system was right. I had to push harder. The next day was a practice English exam. During evening study hall, the tests were graded and returned quickly. Before long, our class president came to my desk and told me Ms. Davis wanted to see me in her office. I sighed internally. It was inevitable. On the English test, I had only filled out a single reading comprehension section. The rest of the paper was completely blank. And sure enough, the moment I stepped in her office, Ms. Davis slammed my English test down on the desk in front of me. James, I don't even have the energy to yell at you anymore. You're a hopeless case. The SATs are just weeks away. Can't you at least do us the courtesy of finishing the test?" She looked completely exasperated. "I remember your middle school transcripts. You were a decent student. What happened to you after freshman year?" I just stood there with my head down, listening in silence, not saying a word in my own defense. After a moment, she seemed to run out of things to say. She just gave a tired wave of her hand, dismissing me. Just as I was turning to leave, Hannah Thompson walked in, carrying a stack of homework assignments. She was stunning, with a radiant smile, and even though she wasn't in our class, Ms. Davis adored her. She must have overheard the part about my decent middle school performance, because a smirk played on her lips and her eyes crinkled, as if she'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Middle school," she chimed in. "That was ages ago. It just goes to show you how much a person can change, right, James?" Her taunting gaze was fixed right on me. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out. As I passed her, I caught a glimpse of her English test score out of the corner of my eye. 130 out of 150. A score like that easily put her at the top of our class. When she noticed me looking at her score, Hannah instinctively straightened her posture, a smug look on her face. It was then that the system's voice finally piped up in my head. Is all this really worth it, just for Ava? I had thrown away 3 years of high school. I was mocked, looked down on, and spent every day just trying to endure it all. As the system's question echoed in my mind, I stared out the window for a long moment before answering quietly, just save her first. I couldn't give up on Ava's chance to live. That would be too cruel. I was still studying as hard as I could, but I knew that on the day of the SATs, the system would be gone. Until then, I had to make every single minute count. I couldn't waste any opportunity to earn back Ava's life. In the practice SATs that followed, my scores got progressively worse. After every test, Hannah and her friends would make a point of laughing at me. She even started coming to my classroom to personally collect my test, flipping to the blank sections and sneering. "You can't even answer these simple questions? I have no idea how you're still a student here. But don't worry, you won't be for long." The other students just treated her taunts as a joke, a bit of entertainment between classes. I never said a word back. While my test scores kept dropping, the notebook where I kept track of problems I got wrong was getting thinner and thinner. The truth was the problems weren't hard for me at all. I could often see the solution instantly. But there was no way to explain that to Hannah. In her eyes, I was just some pathetic admirer who didn't know his place. But the thing is, I had never, ever had a crush on her. I only had 2 goals in life: get into the physics program at Harvard and see Ava get well again. I remember once, I was cornered by some local thugs trying to shake me down. Ava was the one who ran up, grabbed my arm, and pulled me away from them. She carefully put a bandage on my scrapes and smiled. "It'll feel better soon." She was always so good to me. Watching the life value meter on the system's interface steadily climb, I knew Ava was close to a full recovery. Then, on the day of the SATs, the system detached itself, just as it had promised. This wasn't like the practice tests. This time, everything was different. For 2 full days, I took every section seriously, working on each problem right up until the very last second. The moment I finished, I rushed straight to the hospital to see Ava. I had to see for myself if she was completely okay, if there were any lingering effects from her coma. If something was still wrong, I had no idea how I would ever find another system to save her. My heart was pounding with anxiety as I hurried to Downtown General. I stood outside Ava's room for a long moment, taking deep breaths and trying to prepare myself for what I might find before I finally reached for the doorknob. The second I opened the door, a sharp voice cut through the air. "James, what are you doing here?" It was Hannah. She had a few of her friends with her, and they were carrying a pharmacy bag. Hannah's voice was a little stuffy, like she was just getting over a cold. She looked me up and down, an eyebrow arched in a condescending sneer. "What's this? Finally decided to come to the hospital and get your head examined?" Her friends all burst out laughing. I frowned. The hallway was busy with patients and their families, and a few of them were starting to stare at us. I looked right at her. "Want to make a bet?" Hannah just stood there with her arms crossed, a cold look in her eyes, as if she didn't understand. I continued, "I bet my total SAT score is higher than yours." She stared at me for a second, stunned, before letting out a shrill, piercing laugh. James, now I'm positive you've actually lost your mind. Hannah laughed openly, not even trying to hide her contempt. I'd expected this reaction. I just kept my eyes on her and asked calmly, "So, is that a yes or a no?" That only made her laugh harder. "Fine, you're on. If I lose, I'll apologize to you in front of everyone. But if you lose at the class party after the scores are released, you have to get on the floor and crawl around in a circle." Deal. Our class party was already scheduled for the day after scores were released. Hannah was clearly setting this up to humiliate me in front of the entire grade. Before I could answer, I felt a hand on my arm. "Hey, you think you could just walk all over James?" A sharp voice cut in. "Why is it that if you lose, you just have to apologize, but if he loses, he has to crawl on the floor?" "No way. If you lose this bet, you're crawling too." My breath caught in my throat. I know that voice anywhere. I whipped my head around, and there she was standing right next to me. Ava was awake. Ava stared coldly at Hannah. "You might want to think before you speak." The long hospital stay had made her thinner, but there was a new sharpness to her, a brightness in her eyes. Ava's confrontational stare clearly took Hannah by surprise. She wasn't used to being challenged, and her expression immediately soured. But she recovered quickly, forcing a cold smile. "Fine by me, but I'm adding a condition. If his score isn't higher than mine, you have to get on your knees and apologize to me in front of everyone." I started to object, not wanting to drag Ava into this, but before I could say a word, she had already agreed. Hannah shot us one last venomous look before turning on her heel and stalking down the hallway. The hallway fell silent. I looked at Ava, overwhelmed with emotion, not knowing what to say. For a moment, I was completely speechless. It was a shame she'd missed this year's SATs, but with her intelligence, taking them next year would be no problem. I knew her dream had always been to get into the physics program at Harvard. When I didn't say anything, Ava smiled, stood on her toes, and gently pinched my cheek. "You're so thin," she said. She was the one who had lost a ton of weight, but she was worried about me. In her mind, I was the one who must have been suffering for the past 2 years. Even after 2 years in a coma, the trust and connection between us was exactly the same. Ava didn't even know who Hannah was, and she had no idea about the history between us. But in that hallway, she didn't hesitate for a second to take my side. She wasn't worried at all that my score might actually be lower than Hannah's. As if sensing my anxiety, Ava winked at me. "Don't worry about it. Even if you don't beat her, I'll just pretend today never happened. It's not like anyone was recording. What's she gonna do? Physically force me to my knees?" I couldn't help but laugh. The heavy weight that had been pressing down on me for 2 years suddenly felt a lot lighter. Over the next few weeks, Ava had to focus on her physical therapy. I was at the hospital with her almost every day, helping her walk, do her exercises, and catch up on her studies. The night the SAT scores were released, I was just leaving the hospital when I ran into Hannah at the entrance, looking smug and expectant. She said she figured I'd be too scared to check my score, so she'd waited there specifically to watch me squirm. I was too tired to argue, so I didn't object. The moment the clock struck midnight, she snatched my phone and eagerly logged into the results portal for me. The page loaded, and she hit the refresh button several times. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but as I was yawning, Hannah suddenly tossed my phone aside. The look on her face slowly morphed from smug amusement to utter disbelief. "James, don't tell me you didn't even show up for the test," she sneered. I glanced at my phone screen, where a string of zeros was displayed prominently. She had to know that the scores for the top 50 in the state were redacted. She just couldn't accept the possibility that I had beaten her. In her world, someone like me could never surpass her. "You're the one who made the bet," I started to say. Before I could finish, her phone started ringing. She impatiently declined the call, but it immediately started ringing again. Annoyed, she finally answered it. After a brief greeting, she went completely still. She had put the call on speaker. A man's clear voice came through the phone. "Hello, this is the Harvard University admissions office. We were calling to ask if you were interested in attending our university." Hannah froze, as if someone had hit the pause button. I took the phone from her and I gave the man my name and test ID number. His voice immediately became much more enthusiastic, and he asked where I was saying they wanted to come meet with me right away. Throughout the entire call, Hannah just stood there in a daze, her brow furrowed in disbelief. But when the admissions officers from Harvard actually showed up at the hospital entrance a short time later, the look on her face completely shattered. The person she had always treated as a joke was now the person Harvard admissions officers had come to recruit in person. The way she looked at me was a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't decipher. In her mind, I was nothing more than a pathetic admirer she'd left in the dust. Once the Harvard representatives arrived, Hannah clearly wanted to disappear. I was busy asking them about the physics program, so I didn't try to stop her. But just then, I looked up and saw Ava. She had just come out of her room and grabbed Hannah by the arm. Ava's voice was light and teasing. "You didn't forget our little bet, did you? Need me to jog your memory?" Hannah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She bit her lip hard and finally turned to me and mumbled an apology. Ava let out a theatrical yawn. That's funny. I don't remember the terms of the bet being a quiet apology." Humiliated, Hannah tried to pull her arm away from Ava's grasp, but Ava's grip was firm. Finally, with a choked sob, Hannah turned to me and gave a deep, formal bow of apology. By that point, I was already deep in conversation with the admissions officers, confirming the details of my major. I wasn't paying any attention to Hannah anymore. I honestly couldn't be bothered with her drama. But Hannah wasn't done. A few days later, I went to the hospital like usual and was met at the entrance by one of the nurses. Her face was pale and her voice was shaking as she told me that Hannah had just pushed Ava down the stairs. My vision tunneled. I broke into a sprint, taking the stairs two at a time. Why would she go after Ava? When I reached the fourth-floor landing, I saw a group of nurses crowded around the stairwell. Ava was leaning against the wall, her face deathly pale and beaded with a cold sweat. The staircase was long and steep. I couldn't even begin to imagine the pain she must have been in. And at the top of the stairs stood Hannah, showing not a shred of remorse. In her hand, she was clutching a light blue hair clip. I recognized it instantly. It was the one I had given Ava for her birthday, the one they had all mistaken for Hannah's. When she saw me, Hannah pointed and yelled, "That hair clip is mine. You stole it from me and then gave it to her." She was still convinced it belonged to her. But she was wrong. I had bought that clip specifically for Ava. During the years she was in a coma, most people forgot her birthday, but I never did. To me, Ava was irreplaceable. I looked Hannah straight in the eye. Apologized to Ava. Now, I'd seen her lose her cool before, but I'd never seen her look like this. Her face was completely drained of color. Hannah just lifted her chin, defiant. She stubbornly insisted the clip was hers. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. Trying to reason with someone like her was pointless. I should have known better. Because of Hannah's shove, Ava ended up with a hairline fracture in her leg. I demanded an apology, but Hannah refused to say a word. We were at a standoff, so I called the police. As she stared at me in shock, I had hospital security secure the area. For too long, I had let Hannah walk all over me because I never set any boundaries. This time I wasn't backing down. The police arrived quickly. Hannah tried to argue her case, but I had no interest in hearing it. With the officer's help, I was able to pull up the online receipt for the hair clip from several years ago. It was a limited edition item, and the purchase record was clear and easy to find. Hannah stared at the receipt, unable to process it. I had never taken her clip, which also meant I had never had a crush on her. No matter how popular or perfect she seemed to everyone else, to me, she was just a stranger who did nothing but cause problems. It was time to put an end to the ridiculous drama she'd started all because of a misunderstanding. In front of the police, I made my final demand. "Hannah, you're to stay away from Ava. And from me." Hannah was clearly reluctant, but with the police there, she had no choice but to agree. In the end, she was also made to cover all of Ava's medical bills. After she was gone, I went back to Ava's room. She had just started to recover, and now she was back in bed again. I stood beside her and whispered, "I'm so sorry." I didn't think she'd heard me, but then she murmured, "You idiot. You're the last person who needs to apologize." Shortly after summer break started, my acceptance letter from the Harvard physics program arrived. It noted that I was the state's top scorer. When my old classmates heard the news, their first reaction was that it had to be someone else with the same name. They couldn't believe that I was the one who had gotten into Harvard. It wasn't until they saw my name on the school's official honor roll and saw me in a couple of local news interviews that the reality finally started to sink in. Some of the people who had been on the fence before came to me to apologize, saying they'd been led astray and were too young to know better. I was unimpressed. "You were almost adults," I told them. "You should have known right from wrong." My words left them speechless. I knew some of them were genuinely sorry, but for most of them, they were only apologizing because they never expected me to end up where I did. I had no interest in their self-serving apologies. I didn't accept a single one. A lot of people came to say they were sorry, but Hannah was not one of them. She was probably too embarrassed, or maybe just too proud. Either way, I didn't see her at all that summer. Eventually, some of my former classmates started to defend me. They started saying that what Hannah had done to me was straight-up bullying. As for me, I just wanted our story to be over. From the very beginning, she was the one who was constantly putting me down. Her hostility was so obvious you couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, Ava had started studying to catch up on the high school courses she'd missed. Just as I'd expected, she was a quick study and was soon on track to take the SATs the following year. On the day I left for Harvard, she had a commitment she couldn't get out of, so she wasn't able to see me off. I was dragging my suitcase toward the main gate of Harvard when I saw a familiar figure. It was Hannah. My eye twitched involuntarily. Hadn't we agreed to stay out of each other's lives? What was she doing here? I told myself she was probably just passing by, that she wasn't here for me. I grabbed my suitcase and started to walk around her, but she spotted me in the crowd immediately. Her expression went from stunned to a look of unmistakable, overwhelming joy. As I walked past, she reached out and grabbed the hem of my jacket. I knew for a fact that Hannah wasn't going to Harvard. The fact that she was here, stopping me like this, could only mean one thing. She had come looking for me. I stopped and waited for her to speak, wondering what new game she was playing. When I didn't say anything, her eyes suddenly filled with tears, and then she started to cry, right there in front of me. The words she choked out next left me stunned. She said she'd had a crush on me for a long time. She even admitted that she was involved in Ava's accident all those years ago. My heart dropped. I stared down at her, my voice shaking. "What did you just say?" I had always thought we were two people who should have never crossed paths. I never imagined that our lives had become entangled all the way back at the start of freshman year. Through Hannah's halting, tearful story, I finally pieced everything together. Apparently, she'd first noticed me at the very beginning of freshman year. She had always been number one, and she came to high school expecting to be at the top of the class. But when the first rankings were posted, she wasn't number one. I was. From that moment on, she saw me as nothing more than a rival on a spreadsheet. She started studying obsessively, taking extra tutoring, doing anything she could with one single goal in mind, to beat me. But as time went on, her obsession grew into something more than just beating my scores. She found out about Ava, the girl I'd grown up with. Hannah didn't understand what it meant to actually like someone. All she knew was that seeing me and Ava together made her feel a tight, uncomfortable knot in her chest. She couldn't stand the fact that there was already someone in my life. She channeled all of those confusing feelings into a single thought. I refuse to lose to you. And since her family had money, she hired a few local thugs to scare Ava, to try and convince her to stay away from me. But she never expected what would happen next. Cornered in an alley, Ava was so desperate to get away from them that she ran into the street without looking and was hit by a car. The accident was so severe that it left her in a vegetative state. And because there was no evidence, Hannah's involvement was never discovered. In order to save Ava, I started intentionally failing my tests. My grades plummeted, and Hannah finally got what she wanted. She was number one. Later, when I publicly denied having a crush on her, Hannah was furious. She couldn't accept that the person she had once seen as her only rival now looked at her as if she were a complete stranger. She refused to admit that she was the one who had systematically destroyed my life. And yet, she had the audacity to claim that she liked me. When I thought about what she had done to Ava, I was filled with a rage I couldn't contain. It all made sense now. Of course, Ava had recognized her in the hospital. The realization was both sickening and absurd. After she'd confessed everything, she looked like she wanted to say more, to try and explain herself. I just pulled my arm away from her. There was nothing left to say. Do you have any idea what you've done? I said slowly. You stole 2 years of Ava's life. If it weren't for you, she'd be here with me right now, starting college. And that's not even considering what would have happened if I hadn't found the system. Ava could have been in that hospital bed for the rest of her life. Hannah's eyes welled up with tears again. But I really do like you, James. I'm sure I like you more than Ava ever could. I just gave her a flat, cold look. It was laughable. So this was her idea of love? Tearing me down and hurting the person I cared about most, all to satisfy her own selfish ego? I stared her right in the eye. Hannah, I'm only going to say this once. There is nothing between us, and there never will be. If I ever see you anywhere near me or Ava again, I won't be so restrained. She knew exactly what she had done to Ava. This whole confession was just a twisted attempt to frame her actions as some kind of proof of her love for me. A love like that isn't love, it's suffocation. Hannah couldn't seem to accept that I was just walking away. She was finally realizing that I wasn't the same weak kid she could push around and humiliate anymore. My only priority now was protecting Ava. Hannah completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. For someone who had always gotten everything she wanted, this was probably the first time she had ever truly lost control. And I doubt she ever understood why I could never like her. In my mind, her constant attacks and humiliations had nothing to do with love. And I felt no obligation to return the feelings of someone who only ever wanted to crush me. Besides, her so-called crush was never genuine. She wasn't interested in the quiet kid studying in the corner. She was just obsessed with the idea of losing to me. Hannah never understood what it actually meant to care about someone. The gates of Harvard were bustling with students coming and going. She was the only one standing still, crying alone in the middle of the crowd, her makeup a mess. This time, no one came to comfort her. More and more of our old classmates were starting to admit that what Hannah had done to me was, in fact, bullying. They weren't on her side anymore. And I was finally free to pursue a subject I loved, to start a new chapter of my life. A chapter that had no room for Hannah Thompson. The encounter left me with a heavy feeling in my chest. Ava had always been the one protecting me. But it was only today that I realized she could be scared too. What was going through her mind that day in the alley, when she was so terrified that she ran into the street without looking? I'll never know. All I know is that Hannah violently derailed both of our lives. I had just finished unpacking in my dorm room when my phone buzzed. It was Ava. It was noisy on her end. All I could hear was her slightly ragged breathing. After a moment, she said, "James, look down." As if I knew what I would see, I rushed out onto the balcony. I looked down and there she was. Ava was standing below my dorm, smiling and waving up at me. Her leg hadn't fully healed yet. She was still in a cast and using a crutch, but she was standing tall. She had come all this way, limp and all, just to see me. Seeing her there, I suddenly remembered Hannah's words. "I like you more than Ava ever could." It was so clear to me now how wrong she was. The one who had loved me all these years, in her own quiet but unwavering way, was Ava. And I would spend the rest of my life making sure she would never have to suffer like that again. She would never be pushed down a flight of stairs again. She would never have to be that scared and alone. I smiled into the phone. "Wait right there. I'm coming down." I turned and headed for the stairs. From this day forward, all the painful memories associated with Hannah would finally be put behind me. I had Ava. Thank God I had Ava. Epilogue. Ava's perspective. James will probably never know, but after the accident, I developed an ability. I could read minds. I guess you could call it a blessing in disguise. Even when I was completely unresponsive, when the doctors had labeled me as being in a vegetative state, I could hear the thoughts of everyone around me, especially his. I knew he was connected to a strange system, that if he intentionally failed his tests, his lost points would be converted bit by bit into life force for me. I knew all of it. Even though the system offered him nothing in return, he agreed without a moment's hesitation. That's how I knew how much he truly cared about me. At first, I had no idea that Hannah was connected to my accident. But then one day, I heard her thoughts, and I knew. They were smug and dark and full of hate. She wasn't just humiliating James. She was the reason I was in that bed. From that moment on, I swore to myself that I would never let her hurt James or me ever again. I hated Hannah, but I wasn't going to waste my life hating her. There were so many better things to do, so many more important things to focus on, like building a life with James. On the day James moved into Harvard, I snuck over to the campus to surprise him. His dorm was on the 4th floor, and it wasn't long before he came running down the stairs, breathless. The moment he reached me, I could hear his heart pounding in his chest, and I could hear the thought, clear as day, in his mind. I really like Ava. I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Well, I really like him too. A year later, I got into Harvard too. On my first day, I made James carry all my bags for me. It was a sweltering hot day, and I grabbed an old newspaper from a convenience store to use as a fan. It was useless for anything other than fanning myself. And I was about to toss it in the trash when a headline from the page tucked inside caught my eye. Thompson Industries enters bankruptcy proceedings. I froze, reading the line again to make sure. It was Hannah's family's company. It seemed that everything she had once been so proud of was slowly falling apart. Her family status, the wealth she used to flaunt, all of it was gone. When you don't understand love or respect, fate eventually takes back all the advantages. I gently dropped the newspaper into a nearby trash can. James was drowning, trying to decide who should go with him. I linked my arm through his. Whatever you're in the mood for is fine with me. He reached over and ruffled my hair. It's not whatever you're in the mood for. It's whatever my boyfriend is in the mood for. I couldn't stop the huge grin that spread across my face when he said that. We had officially started dating just a few days ago. All the pain and misfortune of the past was finally behind us. There would be no more car accidents, no more falls down the stairs, and no more desperate bargains with a mysterious system. For us, both the Points for Life system and my mind-reading ability felt like a final act of grace from the universe, giving us a chance to find our way back to each other. And for a long time to come, I would go on loving James, just as I always have. This story teaches us that true strength isn't found in arguing against the noise, but in the silent, unwavering focus on the goal. It also reveals the nature of love, one rooted in possession and harm, the other in protection and trust. A person who lacks respect will ultimately be consumed by their own inner ignorance. May we all learn to tune out the world's noise and guard what truly matters in our hearts, because that is the ultimate measure of your worth.